Between 2:15 and 6:30 in the morning on August 18, 1983, 13 men burned alive 600 feet underground in Shaft 7 of the Red Bird Mine, Mingo County, West Virginia. All adults, all miners working the night shift on a disputed coal seam. The method was arson, deliberate and calculated. Exits blocked with heavy equipment. Accelerants poured at strategic choke points. Ignition time to trap everyone below. The perpetrators weren't rival companies or outside saboteurs. They were 4 members of the Sullivan family, a father and his 3 sons, executing what they believed was mountain justice for a claim violation that the law wouldn't address. The West Virginia State Fire Marshal would later call it the deadliest deliberate mining fire in Appalachian history. But the reason wasn't a labor dispute, wasn't organized crime, wasn't even a blood feud passed down through generations. It was a $2.3 million coal seam that had belonged to the Sullivan family since 1897, being mined by men who'd ignored every warning. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Mingo County, West Virginia, sprawled across 423 square miles of some of the most coal-rich and economically devastated terrain in the eastern United States in 1983. The Appalachian Mountains rose in steep ridges, their hollows so narrow that entire communities existed in valleys where sunlight only reached the bottom for 3 hours each day. Population stood around 37,000. Down from 52,000 in the boom years of the 1950s, when King Coal ruled and union wages could build a future. The county seat, Williamson, held barely 4,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's grudges, and each other's desperation going back decades. August, in Mingo County, meant temperatures climbing to 90 degrees by midday, dropping to 68 at night when the mountain air finally cooled. The smell was coal dust that never quite settled, diesel exhaust from mining equipment, and the metallic tang of the Tug Fork River running along the Kentucky border. At night, you could hear the distant rumble of coal trains carrying black gold to power plants hundreds of miles away, the barking of dogs chained outside trailers, and sometimes the crack of a rifle when someone shot at nothing in particular just to hear the echo come back from the ridges. But 1983 was a devastating year for coal country. The industry that had sustained Mingo County for nearly a century was in freefall. Mechanization had eliminated thousands of underground jobs. Continuous mining machines could do the work of 20 men. Longwall systems replaced entire crews. The Reagan administration had slashed federal support for Appalachia, dismantling programs that had kept communities afloat since the War on Poverty. Unemployment in Mingo County hovered around 28% that summer. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking their lives for union wages that once meant something, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent, and food stamps that bought humiliation at the checkout counter. Mines that had employed thousands now sat idle, their portals sealed with concrete, their equipment rusting in the rain. In that economic wasteland, mineral rights became everything. If your family owned the rights to a coal seam, even a small one, you had leverage. You could lease those rights to independent operators, small-time crews willing to work dangerous conditions for a percentage. You could partner with desperate miners who had equipment but no land. The coal was still there, still valuable, still the only resource these mountains possessed. But the legal framework around mineral rights was a nightmare of overlapping claims dating back to the 1800s. Corrupt county clerks who'd sold the same rights twice, surveys that didn't match modern GPS coordinates, and families who'd lost original deeds in house fires or floods or simply to time. The courts were understaffed and overwhelmed. A mineral rights dispute could take 3 years to resolve, cost $15,000 in legal fees, and end with a ruling that satisfied nobody. The sheriff's department had 12 deputies covering 423 square miles. State police barracks sat 43 miles away in Logan. The Federal Bureau of Land Management had theoretical jurisdiction, but actual presence was a surveyor who showed up twice a year. In Mingo County, if someone violated your mineral rights, the law wasn't going to help you fast enough to matter. So men made their own justice. Not always violent, but always final. A disputed seam might see equipment vandalized, tires slashed, threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. Most disputes ended with one party backing down, understanding that pushing too hard meant consequences the law couldn't prevent. But sometimes, when the stakes were high enough and desperation deep enough, men crossed lines they could never uncross. Sometimes they burned the world down, rather than let someone take what generations of their family had bled for. And in August 1983, that's exactly what happened. James Edward Sullivan was 51 years old that August, though he looked closer to 65. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, but walked with a permanent forward stoop from 34 years spent hunched in coal seams barely 4 feet high. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis from wielding a pick in his early years before mechanization, fingers stained permanently black from coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A thick scar ran from his right ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from a roof collapse in 1971 that had killed 2 men standing beside him and left Big Jim buried under rock for 4 hours before rescue crews reached him. He walked with a slight limp, legacy of the same accident, and when the weather turned cold or damp, that limp became pronounced enough that his youngest son had to help him up the porch steps. Every morning, Big Jim woke at 4:30 in the house his grandfather had built in 1923, on 20 acres of ridgeland, overlooking the Tug Fork. He'd make coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, drink it black while smoking 2 unfiltered Pall Malls, and then step outside to watch the sun come up over the Kentucky mountains across the river. He'd been doing this routine since 1968. 15 years. Through mine strikes and layoffs and his father's death and every hardship the coal industry had thrown at him. By 5:30, he'd be heading to whichever mine was currently employing him, though by 1983, that meant 3 days a week at best, scattered shifts that barely covered the mortgage. He'd married Ruth Ann Hensley in 1953, right after his discharge from the Army. They'd had 3 sons. Michael was 30 now, working as a heavy equipment operator when work was available. Daniel was 27, quieter than his older brother, still living at home. Robert was 24, the youngest, married to a girl named Sarah, with a baby daughter Big Jim had never expected to see, given how broke his family was. Ruth Ann was 50, her face worn smooth by worry like a river stone polished by decades of current. Her hands as work-hardened as her husband's from 30 years of washing coal dust out of clothes and trying to make nothing stretch into something. What Big Jim valued most wasn't money, though God knew they needed it with 3 adult sons to help support and no steady income. What he valued was legacy, the idea that a man's work meant something beyond his own life, that what his grandfather had secured and his father had protected would pass to his sons and their sons. His great-grandfather, Ezra Sullivan, had purchased mineral rights to a 17-acre coal seam in 1897 for $12, an amount that had required 2 years of saving. That seam sat beneath ridgeland near Redbird Hollow, untouched for decades because the technology to mine it didn't exist. But by the 1980s, with new drilling techniques and desperate markets, that seam was worth approximately $2.3 million. It represented everything Big Jim's family had ever created, the only inheritance he could leave his children in a world where men like him had nothing else. The Sullivan seam wasn't particularly large, approximately 17 acres of bituminous coal running at a 42-degree angle beneath a ridge 3 miles northeast of Williamson. Geological surveys from 1979 estimated 600,000 tons of recoverable coal at current mining depths. Premium grade with low sulfur content, perfect for steel production. At 1983 market rates of roughly $3.85 per ton, properly mined over 5 years. That seam represented gross revenue of $2.3 million. After equipment costs, labor, and distribution, a family operating independently could clear maybe $400,000, enough to retire on, enough to send grandchildren to college, enough to mean something. But the Sullivan seam existed in legal limbo, like so many Appalachian mineral rights claims. The original 1897 deed from Ezra Sullivan was clear enough, a handwritten document filed with the Mingo County clerk, describing all coal and mineral rights beneath 17 acres, bounded by the ridgeline of Redbird Hollow. Simple, straightforward, witnessed by 3 men, whose signatures were barely legible. But in 1932, during the Depression when the Sullivan family was so broke they nearly lost everything, Ezra's son had signed a lease agreement with Mountaineer Coal Company, allowing them to explore mineral rights on adjacent land. That lease agreement, stored in a file box that survived a courthouse fire in 1947, contained survey coordinates that overlapped the original Sullivan claim by approximately 3 acres. For decades, this hadn't mattered because nobody was mining the area. The seam was too deep for early 20th century technology, too steep for safe access, too remote from rail lines to make transportation economical. But by the late 1970s, everything changed. New continuous mining techniques made steep seams accessible. Diesel trucks could haul coal on improved mountain roads. The energy crisis had driven coal prices high enough to justify difficult extractions. Suddenly, those overlapping 3 acres mattered. Suddenly, multiple parties could claim legal right to mine the same ground. And suddenly, violence became inevitable. Big Jim had discovered the overlap in 1980 when a lawyer in Charleston, reviewing the Sullivan deed for a potential lease agreement, found the conflicting survey coordinates. The lawyer explained that resolving this would require a quiet title action, court proceedings that could take 2 to 4 years and cost upwards of $20,000 in legal fees, money the Sullivan family absolutely did not have. The lawyer also explained that possession was 9/10 of the law in mineral rights disputes, meaning whoever started mining first would have enormous legal advantage. So Big Jim had done what his grandfather would have done. He'd filed a notice of intent to mine with the county clerk, posted no trespassing signs on every access road, and made it known throughout Mingo County that anyone who touched the Sullivan seam would answer to him personally. For 3 years, that had been enough. People knew Big Jim Sullivan. They knew his father, knew his grandfather, knew the family had legitimate historical claim, even if the paperwork was complicated. They knew Big Jim had sons who'd back him up, knew he'd fought in Korea, knew he wasn't someone to cross lightly. But in June 1983, everything changed when Frank Hartley, a 46-year-old independent mine operator, filed his own notice of intent. Based on that 1932 lease agreement, his lawyer claimed, gave him superior rights. Frank James Hartley was 46 years old that summer, a stocky man with a thick beard, gone mostly gray, and hands missing the tip of his left index finger from a conveyor belt accident in 1974. He'd been mining coal since age 17, 29 years underground, starting as a roof bolter and working his way up to shift supervisor before the big companies started laying everyone off. By 1982, Frank was unemployed like everyone else, 53 weeks of benefits exhausted, watching his savings disappear and his family's future collapse. So he'd done what desperate men do. He'd mortgaged his house for $37,000, bought used mining equipment at auction, and started his own independent operation with 11 other laid-off miners who'd pooled their severance payments and their hope. The Hartley crew wasn't a company in any real sense. They were 12 men, ages 22 to 48, who'd worked together at various union mines and trusted each other enough to risk everything on one shot at staying afloat. They had 2 continuous miners, a shuttle car, ventilation equipment, and enough diesel fuel to run operations for maybe 4 months if they could find a seam to work. What they didn't have was mineral rights. Every established claim in Mingo County was locked up by families or corporations, Every accessible seam was already being mined or was too depleted to bother with, except the Sullivan seam, and except for a lawyer named Richard Vance who'd approached Frank Hartley in May 1983 with an offer. Vance represented something called Mountaineer Development Corporation, a shell company that claimed superior rights to the Sullivan seam based on that 1932 lease agreement. Vance showed Frank the paperwork, showed him survey maps, showed him a legal opinion stating that the Mountaineer lease predated and superseded the Sullivan family claim. Vance offered Frank a 60-40 split, 60% to Mountaineer for providing legal protection, 40% to the Hartley crew for actually mining the coal. On a seam worth $2.3 million, even 40% meant enough money to save 12 families. Frank had hesitated. He knew Big Jim Sullivan. He knew the Sullivan family's reputation. He knew this would cause problems. But Vance had assured him the law was on their side, that Big Jim's claims were legally invalid, that any threats would be handled through proper channels. So, on June 7, 1983, the Hartley crew had driven their equipment up the access road to Redbird Hollow, cut the locks on Big Jim's gates, and started drilling their first exploratory shaft. They worked night shifts to avoid confrontation, 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., rotating crews of 6 to 7 men underground, while the rest operated surface equipment. They mined cautiously, knowing trouble was coming but hoping legal process would resolve things before violence became necessary. The crew included Frank's younger brother, Tommy, 39, who had 2 daughters in high school. It included Jerome Maxwell, 28, newly married with a pregnant wife. It included David Chen, 41, who'd immigrated from China in 1972 specifically for coal mining jobs. 13 men total when you counted everyone who rotated through the night shifts. 13 men who believed they were following the law. 13 men who had no idea they were sealing their own fate every time they descended into that shaft. Big Jim Sullivan discovered the Hartley crew's operation on June 9, 1983, a Thursday morning when he drove up to Redbird Hollow to check his posted claims, and found fresh tire tracks cutting through mud still wet from overnight rain. His gates, which he'd locked with grade 8 hardened steel chains, had been cut clean through with an industrial bolt cutter. The locks lay in the dirt like discarded promises. He followed the tracks 2 miles up the access road and found it. A ventilation shaft pumping air underground. The unmistakable sound of a continuous miner chewing through coal 600 feet below his boots. Someone was mining the Sullivan seam. Someone had ignored his notices, his warnings, his family's 86 years of documented ownership. Big Jim stood there for 11 minutes. He'd later tell investigators, just listening to that distant mechanical grinding. He didn't go down, didn't confront anyone, didn't make threats. He walked back to his truck, drove to the Mingo County Courthouse, and filed a formal complaint with the clerk's office. The clerk, a woman named Barbara Simmons, who'd gone to high school with Big Jim's younger sister, looked at the paperwork and sighed. She explained what Big Jim already knew. The Hartley crew had filed their own notice of intent backed by Mountaineer Development Corporation's lawyer. Both claims were now in dispute. Resolution would require a court hearing that might not happen for 6 to 8 months, given current backlog. Until then, technically, both parties had colorable claims. Technically, the Hartley crew wasn't breaking the law. Big Jim had driven home and told Ruth Ann what was happening. She'd cried, not from sadness but from recognition. She'd been married to Big Jim for 30 years, had watched him bury his father, had seen him carry men out of collapsed mines, had witnessed every moment that had hardened him into someone who couldn't bend without breaking. She begged him to let the lawyers handle it. He'd nodded, said he would, but they both knew he was lying. That night, Big Jim drove back to Redbird Hollow alone and waited in the darkness until the Hartley crew's trucks arrived for night shift. He counted 7 men, watched them gear up, watched them descend into the shaft his family owned, watched them steal his children's inheritance 1 ton at a time. At 2:30 a.m., when the crew emerged for their midnight break, Big Jim stepped into their headlights. Frank Hartley recognized him immediately, told his men to wait by the trucks. The two men talked for 17 minutes. Frank explained about mountaineer development, about the legal opinion, about the 1932 lease that supposedly gave him rights. Big Jim explained about his great-grandfather buying those rights in 1897, about 4 generations of Sullivans protecting that seam, about how Frank was stealing the only thing of value his family possessed. Frank said he understood, said he sympathized, said his own family was starving too, said the law would sort it out. Big Jim said the law didn't matter in the mountains. Frank said maybe it should. They parted without violence, but something had been established in that conversation. A line had been drawn. Frank Hartley had chosen to cross it anyway. Over the next 6 weeks, Big Jim tried every legal avenue available to a man with no money and no connections. He drove to Charleston to meet with a different lawyer who quoted him $18,000 to file a quiet title action. He contacted the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, who said they couldn't intervene in ownership disputes. He called the Mingo County Sheriff, who said it was a civil matter. He even wrote a letter to the governor's office that was answered by a form letter about respecting the legal process. Every door closed. Every system failed. Every authority told him to wait, be patient, trust the courts. Meanwhile, the Hartley crew kept mining, kept stealing, kept taking what belonged to his sons. By late July 1983, Big Jim had spent every dollar he could scrape together on lawyers who couldn't help and filing fees that accomplished nothing. He'd borrowed $800 from his brother in Kentucky just to pay the mortgage. His sons were working occasional day labor, digging ditches for $6 an hour. Barely enough to buy groceries. Ruth Ann had taken a job cleaning houses for people who'd once been their neighbors, people who whispered about the Sullivans losing everything while strangers mined their coal. The humiliation was crushing. But what destroyed Big Jim wasn't poverty. He'd been poor before. What destroyed him was watching the law protect thieves while good men starved. The mine operators in Mingo County understood what was happening. They'd seen it before. Mountaineer Development Corporation was a scam, a shell company created specifically to exploit overlapping claims and legal gray areas. The lawyer, Richard Vance, specialized in finding these disputes, convincing desperate miners to work under questionable authority, and counting on the fact that poor families couldn't afford to fight back in court. By the time cases got resolved, the coal would be gone, the shell company dissolved, the profits hidden offshore. It was theft dressed up in legal language, and everyone knew it, but knowing didn't stop it. Big Jim started spending his evenings at Mel's Tavern in Williamson, nursing bottles of Rolling Rock and listening to other miners talk about their own losses. Men who'd lost land to eminent domain seizures. Men who'd been injured in mines and denied black lung benefits. Men who'd watched companies declare bankruptcy to avoid pension obligations. Every story ended the same way. The law protected corporations and lawyers. The law didn't protect people like them, the old-timers, the men who remembered when Mingo County meant something, when a handshake mattered more than contracts. They'd tell stories about mountain justice, about disputes settled with fists or rifles instead of courts, about codes that predated law and mattered more because law could be twisted but codes couldn't. Big Jim's grandfather had told him stories from the mine wars of the 1920s, when Union organizers fought Pinkerton agents in pitched battles across these same ridges. The law had been on the side of the coal companies then, too. Deputies had shot strikers. Judges had issued injunctions against collective bargaining. Federal troops had occupied the county. But the miners had fought anyway because some things mattered more than law. The right to organize, the right to safe working conditions, the right to be treated like human beings instead of equipment. Big Jim's grandfather had been wounded at the Battle of Blair Mountain, carried a bullet in his hip for 43 years, and never once regretted it. He told Big Jim that when the law fails, men have to make their own justice. By August 1st, Big Jim had made his decision. He told Ruth Ann he was done waiting for courts. She'd begged him to reconsider, reminded him he had grandchildren now, reminded him prison would destroy their family worse than poverty. He'd held her hands, those work-worn hands that had held him together through everything, and told her some things were worth more than freedom. Some things defined whether you were a man or just someone pretending. His great-grandfather had bought those mineral rights with 2 years of savings. His grandfather had protected them through the Depression. His father had kept them through strikes and layoffs. And Big Jim would be damned if he'd be the generation that let them go without a fight. Big Jim called his 3 sons to the house on August 3rd, a Wednesday evening when the heat still hung thick at 8 p.m. and cicadas screamed from the trees. Michael drove over from his apartment in town. Daniel walked down from his room upstairs. Robert came with his wife Sarah and their 8-month-old daughter, who Ruth Ann took to the bedroom so they could talk. The 4 Sullivan men sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Big Jim's grandfather had rolled cigarettes and planned union meetings, where his father had taught him to read, where every important family decision had been made for 60 years. Big Jim laid out the situation without decoration. The Hartley crew was stealing their seam. The law wouldn't stop them. They'd mined approximately 40,000 tons already, worth roughly $150,000. At their current rate, the entire seam would be exhausted in 8 months. Everything 4 generations had protected would be gone. Michael, the oldest, understood immediately where this was heading. He'd served 3 years in the Army, stationed in Germany, trained in demolitions and tactical operations. He asked his father what exactly he was proposing. Big Jim said he was proposing they stop the Hartley crew permanently, not through courts, not through lawyers, but through action. Michael asked if that meant violence. Big Jim said it meant whatever was necessary to protect what belonged to them. Daniel, quieter than his brother, asked if anyone would get hurt. Big Jim said the Hartley crew had made their choice. They'd been warned. They'd ignored every opportunity to walk away. Robert, the youngest, with a baby daughter sleeping in the next room, asked what would happen to their families if they got caught. Big Jim said getting caught meant prison. Not getting caught meant survival. But doing nothing meant losing everything and teaching their children that theft was acceptable if you had lawyers. They talked for 4 hours. Michael argued they should sabotage equipment, not people. Daniel suggested one more attempt at legal resolution. Robert wanted to involve the union, pressure the Hartley crew through labor channels. Big Jim listened to every objection, every alternative, every reason not to do what he was already determined to do. Then he reminded them of what it meant to be a Sullivan. Their family had never backed down. Their family had fought at Blair Mountain when fighting meant death. Their family had walked picket lines when companies sent thugs with baseball bats. Their family protected what was theirs because nobody else would, and if his sons weren't willing to stand with him, he'd understand, but he'd do it alone. Michael agreed first, then Daniel, then Robert, who cried as he said yes but said it anyway because he was Big Jim's son and some obligations ran deeper than law or conscience. They spent the next 2 weeks planning. Michael handled reconnaissance, driving past Redbird Hollow at different times to document the Hartley crew's schedule. They worked 7 nights a week, 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., rotating shifts of 6 to 7 men underground. Surface crew stayed topside to operate ventilation and manage the conveyor. The mine had 2 exits, the main shaft and an emergency escape tunnel that came out 300 yards north. Both had to be blocked to trap everyone below. Daniel researched accelerants, determined that diesel fuel mixed with fertilizer would burn hot enough and long enough to overcome any underground firefighting attempts. Robert, who worked part-time at a farm supply store, acquired 95 gallons of diesel and 200 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer across 3 different counties using cash. They chose August 17th for no particular reason except the weather forecast showed clear skies, and the Hartley crew schedule indicated a full shift of 7 men underground that night. Big Jim withdrew his last $412 from their savings account. Ruth Ann watched him count the bills, and knew what they meant. She didn't ask. She'd stopped asking after that first conversation, when he'd made clear his mind was set. She just held him that night, memorizing the feel of him, knowing this might be the last time they'd be together outside prison walls. Wednesday, August 17th, 1983, started like any other day at the Sullivan house. Big Jim woke at 4:30, made coffee, smoked his cigarettes on the porch while watching the sun rise over the Kentucky mountains. He drove to a day labor site in Williamson, where a construction crew needed help digging foundation trenches. Worked 8 hours in 93-degree heat for $48 cash. Came home, showered, ate the dinner Ruth Ann had made, meatloaf and green beans from her garden, sat in his chair, reading the Williamson Daily News while she washed dishes. A completely normal Wednesday evening in a completely normal life that would end in approximately 6 hours. Michael spent the day working on his truck's transmission in his apartment parking lot. Daniel helped Ruth Ann with yard work, trimming hedges and mowing grass, avoiding her eyes because he knew she knew. Robert went to his job at the farm supply store, sold a woman some chicken feed and a man some fence posts, came home and held his daughter for a long time while Sarah made dinner, memorizing the weight of her, the smell of her, the sound of her laughing. None of the Sullivan men talked about what was coming. They'd said everything that needed saying 2 weeks ago. Now there was only waiting and then doing. At 10:15 p.m., Big Jim's truck pulled into Michael's apartment complex. Michael was waiting with 2 military surplus duffel bags containing the diesel fuel in sealed containers. They drove to Daniel's place, where he loaded 3 more containers and the fertilizer, already mixed according to specifications Michael had provided. Then they drove to Robert's house. Robert kissed his daughter's forehead while she slept, kissed Sarah and told her he'd be back late. Tried to make it sound casual, even though they both knew it wasn't. Sarah didn't ask where he was going. She'd learned not to ask questions when the Sullivan men had that look. The 4 of them drove in silence, up Route 49, toward Redbird Hollow. 11:27 p.m., by the truck's dashboard clock. Traffic was non-existent this time of night. A few coal trucks heading south toward the rail yards. A state trooper parked at a gas station in Del Barton who didn't look up as they passed. The access road to the mine was dark. No streetlights this far from town, just their headlights cutting through August humidity that sat on everything like a wet blanket. They parked 300 yards from the mine entrance, killed the lights, and waited. At 11:49, the Hartley crew's trucks arrived. 6 men in 2 vehicles. They unloaded equipment, talked for a few minutes, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee from thermoses. At 12:07, all 6 descended into the main shaft. Big Jim checked his watch. Michael and Daniel would handle the main shaft. Robert would cover the emergency exit. Big Jim would coordinate and watch the access road. They had 2 hours before the crew's normal break at 2:15 a.m. 2 hours to position everything. Michael carried 40 gallons of diesel mixture to the main shaft head frame. The night was hot, 81 degrees at midnight, and carrying that weight made sweat pour down his back. He placed containers at the shaft collar, the hoist house, and along the timber bracing. Daniel brought the fertilizer mixture, spreading it in a pattern that would feed the fire down into the shaft rather than outward. They worked in darkness, except for small flashlights, moving with precision Michael had learned in the Army, specific tasks executed in specific order. Robert walked 300 yards through woods to the emergency exit, a 42-inch diameter ventilation shaft with a steel ladder descending 600 feet. He carried 30 gallons of diesel and a heavy steel plate Michael had fabricated. The plate would bolt over the exit, sealing it. The diesel would prevent anyone from cutting through. He worked quickly, his hands shaking. A screech owl called from the trees. A distant dog barked. Otherwise, silence. Otherwise, just the sound of his own breathing and the certainty that he was crossing a line his daughter would someday have to live with. By 1:45 a.m., everything was positioned. Big Jim stood by the main shaft, a cigarette lighter in his hand, waiting. Michael and Daniel stood with him. Robert radioed from the emergency exit using walkie-talkies Michael had bought at an army surplus store. Everyone in position. 600 feet below, 13 men were mining coal that didn't belong to them, completely unaware that the world above had just condemned them to death. At 2:14 a.m., on August 18, 1983, Big Jim Sullivan ignited a diesel-soaked rag and dropped it into 40 gallons of fuel mixture positioned at the main shaft entrance of the Red Bird mine. The flames caught immediately, spreading across accelerant that had been poured in patterns designed to maximize heat and smoke penetration. Within 30 seconds, fire engulfed the headframe. Within 90 seconds, black smoke was pouring down the shaft, drawn by ventilation systems that were now working against the men trapped below. Michael dropped a second ignition source into the hoist house, ensuring the mechanical lift would be inoperable. Daniel ignited the timber bracing, creating structural collapse that would prevent any rescue attempt. The main entrance became an inferno, feeding itself down into darkness where 6 men were working and 7 more were on break. 600 feet underground, Frank Hartley was operating a continuous miner when the smoke reached him. It came with the ventilation air at first, just a faint smell of diesel and burning wood that didn't belong. He stopped the machine, told his crew to hold position. Tommy Hartley, Frank's younger brother, was bolting roof supports 20 feet away. Jerome Maxwell was operating the shuttle car that carried coal to the conveyor. David Chen was testing for methane gas at the working face. Marcus Williams and James Little were setting timber supports. All 6 men stopped when the smoke smell hit them. Frank radioed to the surface crew, asking if there was a problem. No response. Tried again. Nothing. The smoke was getting thicker now, no longer a smell but a visible presence rolling through the shaft like fog, and Frank understood immediately. Fire, on the surface, blocking their exit. He ordered everyone to the emergency escape shaft, 300 yards through the mine's north tunnel. They ran, leaving equipment, leaving everything, just moving toward the exit that was supposed to save their lives. But when they reached it, they found Robert Sullivan's steel plate bolted across the opening and diesel fire burning at the base. The heat was intense enough to melt the rubber on their boots. The smoke was choking them now. Carbon monoxide from incomplete combustion mixing with coal dust in air that had nowhere to go. Frank made the call to retreat back to the working face, to the area farthest from the main shaft, to the place where air might stay breathable longest. They had maybe 15 minutes before the smoke killed them, maybe 20 if they were lucky. On the surface, 7 more Hartley crew members were dealing with their own nightmare. The foreman, Carl Henderson, age 51, had been operating surface equipment when the fires started. He'd grabbed 2 fire extinguishers and tried to fight the flames at the main shaft, but the heat drove him back after 30 seconds. His assistant, Maria Garcia, 29, was the only woman on the crew, a single mother of 2 who handled the conveyor controls. She'd tried to radio for help but found their communications equipment sabotaged. Thomas Wright, 43, had grabbed a pry bar and tried to remove burning timber to reach the shaft. Burned his hands so badly the flesh blistered immediately, kept trying anyway, because his cousin was one of the 6 men below. Michael Keene, 34, ran for his truck to drive for help but found all 4 tires slashed. Kevin Morrison, 27, tried to descend the burning shaft anyway. Made it 15 feet before smoke overcame him. Had to be pulled back by Marcus Johnson, 39, who understood they were watching murder happen and couldn't stop it. Sarah Lynn, 42, the crew's equipment operator, stood frozen, listening to screaming coming from 600 feet down, screaming that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Big Jim, Michael, Daniel, and Robert watched from 200 yards away. They could hear the screaming too, could see the surface crew running, panicking, trying to save men who couldn't be saved. Michael vomited twice, bent over with his hands on his knees, heaving up everything in his stomach. Daniel was crying silently. Robert had his face buried in his hands, But Big Jim stood watching with an expression that was neither satisfaction nor regret, just a terrible certainty. He'd warned them. He'd told Frank Hartley what would happen if they didn't stop. He'd followed every rule, every code his grandfather had taught him. And when those rules were ignored, when his family's legacy was stolen anyway, he'd done what had to be done. The screaming lasted 11 more minutes. Then silence. Then just the sound of fire consuming everything it touched. 600 feet below ground, Frank James Hartley died first at approximately 2:37 a.m., overcome by carbon monoxide, while trying to seal off their section with canvas tarps to create a breathable pocket. His younger brother Tommy held him as he convulsed, tried to perform CPR even though he knew it was pointless, breathed the same poisoned air that was killing them both. Tommy died at 2:41, still holding his brother, both men lying on coal they'd mined, thinking it would save their families. Jerome Maxwell, 28 years old, with a wife 7 months pregnant, survived until 2:49 by breathing through a water-soaked shirt. He'd tried crawling toward the emergency exit one more time, made it 70 yards before his lungs gave out. His body was found face down, fingers scraped bloody from clawing at rock, trying to dig his way out. David Chen, 41, had emigrated from Guangdong province in 1972, specifically because American coal mines paid wages that could support extended family back home. He'd sent money to his mother every month for 11 years. He died at 2:52, calling out in Cantonese for his wife and 3 children who lived in a trailer near Williamson. Marcus Williams, 37, a Vietnam veteran who'd survived 13 months in the jungle, only to die in a West Virginia coal mine, lasted until 2:56. He'd written a message in coal dust on the tunnel wall. "Tell my daughter I love her." James Little, 31, had just been accepted to community college, planning to study engineering, trying to build a future beyond mining. He died at 3:02, his acceptance letter still in his truck on the surface. On the surface, the 7 surviving crew members faced their own hell. Carl Henderson, the foreman who'd tried to fight the fire with extinguishers, made the decision at 2:43 to run for help. He and Thomas Wright took Wright's truck, which still had air in 2 tires, and drove on the rims 4 miles to the nearest house with a phone. They called 911 at 2:58. The Mingo County Sheriff's dispatcher took the information, promised emergency response, asked them to return to the mine. By the time Henderson and Wright drove back at 3:17, it was already too late. Maria Garcia had collapsed from smoke inhalation trying to get close enough to the shaft to hear if anyone was still alive. Michael Keene and Kevin Morrison were attempting to dig an alternate entrance using a backhoe, moving earth in a desperate, pointless attempt to reach men who were already dead. Marcus Johnson, 39, the equipment operator who'd pulled Michael Keene back from the burning shaft, later told investigators he'd seen 4 figures watching from the tree line around 2:30 a.m. He couldn't identify them in the darkness, couldn't say for certain they were men and not shadows, but he'd felt watched, felt like whoever started this fire had stayed to make sure it finished what they'd started. Sarah Lynn, 42, testified she'd heard a truck engine around 3:05, distant but distinct, heading away from the mine down the access road. But she'd been in shock, focused on the fire, focused on the screaming that had finally stopped, and by the time she thought to look, the taillights were gone. The volunteer fire department from Williamson arrived at 3:29 a.m. 6 firefighters in 2 trucks, with equipment designed for house fires, completely inadequate for a mine fire burning 600 feet underground. The chief, Daniel McKinley, age 56, took one look at the situation and called for state resources. The West Virginia Office of Miners' Health, Safety, and Training sent a rescue team from Charleston that arrived at 5:47 a.m. By then, the fire had been burning for 3 hours and 33 minutes. The rescue coordinator, James Patterson, evaluated conditions and determined entry was impossible until the fire was suppressed. They pumped water and foam down the main shaft for 4 hours. At 9:53 a.m., the fire was finally controlled enough to send a team down. They found all 6 bodies clustered in the north tunnel, approximately 200 yards from the working face. Frank and Tommy Hartley were together. Jerome Maxwell was alone, face down. David Chen was curled in a fetal position. Marcus Williams was on his back beside his message to his daughter. James Little was near the emergency exit, hands burned from trying to move the steel plate that had sealed his fate. The rescue team brought them up one by one, body bags carried by men who'd worked with some of these miners, who'd known them, who understood this wasn't an accident. The medical examiner would later rule all 6 deaths as homicide by smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning. Time of death estimated between 2:37 and 3:02 a.m., but the total wasn't 6. At 6:37 a.m., when the day shift arrived to relieve the night crew, they found 7 more bodies. The surface crew, who'd survived the initial fire, who'd fought to save their friends below, had succumbed to secondary smoke inhalation and burns sustained during rescue attempts. Maria Garcia had died at approximately 4:15 a.m. from acute respiratory distress. Thomas Wright had died at 4:41 from third-degree burns covering 60% of his body. Carl Henderson had died at 5:03 from smoke inhalation during his second attempt to enter the shaft. Michael Keene had died at 5:29 from cardiac arrest induced by carbon monoxide exposure. Kevin Morrison had died at 5:51 from burns and smoke inhalation. Marcus Johnson had died at 6:08, outliving everyone, dying just 19 minutes before help arrived. Sarah Lynn had died at 6:23, the last victim, found sitting against a tree 200 yards from the mine entrance, having walked away from the carnage and simply stopped breathing. 13 people total, 6 men underground who'd been mining coal, 7 people on the surface who'd tried to save them, ages ranging from 27 to 51. 13 families destroyed, 23 children left without fathers or mothers, 47 grandchildren who'd never know their grandparents. Big Jim Sullivan, Michael Sullivan, Daniel Sullivan, and Robert Sullivan had returned home at 3:32 a.m. They'd burned their clothes in a barrel behind Big Jim's house. They'd showered using lye soap, trying to remove any trace of diesel or smoke. They'd sat in Big Jim's kitchen drinking coffee and saying nothing while the sun came up over the mountains, just like every other morning, except this morning they were murderers. The Mingo County Sheriff's Department received the 911 call at 2:58 a.m., but the first deputy didn't arrive at Redbird Mine until 3:41, 43 minutes lost to confusion about the exact location and roads that were barely marked on county maps. Deputy James Walsh, 29 years old with 3 years on the force, had expected an industrial accident. What he found was a war zone, fires still burning at the main shaft, equipment destroyed, people running in circles, screaming incoherently, bodies visible on the surface, and a smell that would stay with him for the rest of his career, burning diesel mixed with burning flesh and the particular chemical odor of coal smoke that had passed through human lungs. Walsh called for backup, called for ambulances, called for the state police and the fire marshal, and anyone else he could think of because this was bigger than anything Mingo County could handle alone. By 4:17 a.m., the scene had 17 emergency responders, and by sunrise that number had grown to 64. West Virginia State Police Captain Frank Morrison arrived at 5:33 from the Logan Barracks, took command of what was obviously a crime scene, and started making the calls that would bring federal investigators. The FBI field office in Charleston was notified at 6:09. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was notified at 6:47 because accelerants were clearly involved. The Mine Safety and Health Administration was notified at 7:12 because this was technically a workplace incident. By 8 a.m., reporters had arrived from Williamson, Huntington, and Charleston. By 9 a.m., camera crews from television stations were setting up outside the police perimeter. By 10 a.m., this was national news. CNN ran a breaking news banner. CBS interrupted regular programming. The New York Times had a reporter on a chartered flight from Pittsburgh. 13 dead in an Appalachian mining fire wasn't just a local tragedy. It was a symbol of everything wrong with coal country, with Reagan-era deregulation, with an industry that had been killing workers for 100 years. Except this wasn't an accident. This was murder. And that fact, which became clear to investigators within the first 6 hours, transformed the story from industrial tragedy to something much darker. The evidence was overwhelming and immediately obvious. Accelerant patterns at both the main shaft and emergency exit. The steel plate bolted over the escape route, something that would never occur naturally. Slashed tires on crew vehicles. Sabotaged communications equipment. Witnesses who'd seen figures in the tree line. And the simple fact that someone had known exactly how to trap miners underground and exactly how to prevent rescue. This wasn't random. This was planned, methodical, personal. Captain Morrison told his team at 11:37 a.m. that they were looking for someone with mining knowledge, someone with a grudge against the Hartley crew specifically, and someone desperate enough to commit mass murder. The first family notifications began at 7:49 a.m. Jerome Maxwell's wife, Keisha, 7 months pregnant, answered her door to find 2 sheriff's deputies and a chaplain. She knew immediately. Started screaming before they said a word. Fell to her knees in her living room, hands on her belly, screaming that Jerome was supposed to be there for the birth, supposed to be there for his daughter, supposed to be safe. David Chen's wife, May, was notified at 8:03. She spoke limited English, didn't fully understand what the deputies were telling her until a neighbor came over to translate. Then she collapsed, silent, just stopped standing and sat on her kitchen floor staring at nothing while her 3 children cried and asked where their father was. Tommy Hartley's wife, Rebecca, was notified at 8:19. She had 2 daughters, ages 14 and 16, both still asleep when the deputies knocked. Rebecca woke them, held them both while a stranger explained their father was dead, their uncle was dead, and they died together underground. Frank Hartley's widow, Susan, was notified at 8:37. She'd been awake since 3 a.m., worried when Frank didn't come home, calling the mine with no answer, knowing something was wrong. When the deputies arrived, she asked one question: did he suffer? They lied and said no, said it was quick, said he wouldn't have felt anything. But she knew they were lying. She'd been a miner's wife for 22 years. She knew what smoke inhalation meant. She knew what burning alive meant. By noon on August 18th, 13 families had been destroyed. 23 children had lost parents. 47 people had lost sons or daughters. The community of Williamson, population 4,000, was in shock. Every family knew someone who'd died. Every church was planning funerals. Every business closed for the day out of respect. The local funeral home, Morrison and Sons, called in assistance from 3 neighboring counties because they couldn't handle 13 bodies simultaneously. The Mingo County Coroner's Office, staffed by 1 elected coroner and 2 part-time assistants, was completely overwhelmed. The autopsies would take 4 days. The death certificates would take 2 weeks. The toxicology reports would take 6 weeks. But the cause of death was never in question. Homicide, 13 counts, premeditated, calculated, methodical murder. The investigation began in earnest at 1:15 p.m. on August 18th when FBI Special Agent Raymond Cross arrived from Charleston with a team of 7 federal investigators. Cross was 43 years old, 16 years with the Bureau, specializing in violent crimes and domestic terrorism. He'd worked the aftermath of the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia in 1985, had investigated Klan violence in Alabama in 1979, had seen calculated mass murder before, but this was different. This was economic violence. This was someone killing over property, over money, over something that should have been resolved in a courtroom. Cross set up a command post at the Mingo County Sheriff's Office and started building a profile. The killer, or killers, had intimate knowledge of mining operations. They knew shift schedules, knew ventilation systems, knew exactly how to trap people underground. They had access to significant quantities of accelerant and the skill to deploy it effectively. They had a specific grudge against the Hartley crew, not random violence but targeted elimination, and they'd stayed to watch, to ensure completion, suggesting this was personal rather than professional. Cross asked Captain Morrison for a list of anyone who'd had disputes with Frank Hartley or his operation. Morrison's list had 43 names. Coal country was built on disputes. But when Cross added the filter of who had mining knowledge and who had stayed local, the list narrowed to 9 names, and at the top was James Edward Sullivan. By 3:47 p.m., investigators had discovered the mineral rights dispute. County records showed both the Sullivan family's original 1897 claim and Mountaineer Development Corporation's competing claim based on the 1932 lease. They found Big Jim's complaint filed on June 9th. They found witness statements from Mel's Tavern where Big Jim had been overheard saying the Hartley crew would pay for stealing what's mine. They found the confrontation on June 9th when Big Jim had warned Frank Hartley personally. The motive was crystal clear. The opportunity was obvious. All they needed was evidence tying the Sullivans to the actual crime. That evidence came at 6:32 p.m. when a state police forensics team found tire tracks at the mine entrance matching the tread pattern of a 1976 Ford F-250, the exact make and model that Michael Sullivan drove. They found boot prints matching size 13 Red Wing work boots, which Big Jim wore. They found a cigarette butt, unfiltered Pall Mall, Big Jim's brand, tested later for DNA that would match his profile. They found diesel fuel residue that matched fuel sold at a farm supply store where Robert Sullivan worked part-time. Every piece of evidence pointed the same direction. The Sullivan family had murdered 13 people over a coal seam. At 8:53 p.m. on August 18th, 30 hours after the fire started, Captain Morrison led a team of 12 officers to the Sullivan residence. Big Jim was sitting on his porch, drinking coffee, watching the sunset like he did every evening. Ruth Ann was inside making dinner. Michael, Daniel, and Robert were not present. Morrison read Big Jim his rights. Big Jim listened without expression, then asked one question. "Can I finish my coffee?" Morrison said no. Big Jim stood, put his hands behind his back for handcuffs, and told Ruth Ann through the screen door that she should call their neighbor's son, who was a lawyer in Charleston. Ruth Ann screamed. Just once, a sound of pure anguish, then went silent. She'd known this was coming. From the moment Big Jim had told her his plan, she'd known it would end with him in handcuffs or dead. Michael Sullivan was arrested at his apartment at 9:17 p.m. He answered the door already dressed, bag packed, completely unsurprised. He asked if he could call his girlfriend. They said no. He asked if his father had been arrested. They said yes. He nodded and walked to the patrol car without resistance. Daniel Sullivan was arrested at 9:41 p.m. He was in his room at his parents' house, where he'd been since 8 p.m., sitting in darkness. When the officers came for him, he was crying. He asked if he could say goodbye to his mother. They let him. He hugged Ruth Ann and whispered something the officers couldn't hear. She held his face and told him she loved him. Then they took him. Robert Sullivan was the hardest to find. He wasn't at his house. His wife Sarah claimed she didn't know where he was, though investigators suspected she was lying. They found him at 11:53 p.m. in his truck, parked at a scenic overlook 20 miles outside Williamson, looking down at the lights of the town where his daughter would grow up knowing her father was a murderer. He had a loaded .38 revolver on the seat beside him. Officers approached with weapons drawn, but Robert put his hands on the steering wheel and didn't move. They asked if he was planning to hurt himself. He said he'd been thinking about it for 3 hours but couldn't do it because his daughter deserved better than a coward. By midnight on August 18th, all 4 Sullivan men were in custody at the Mingo County Jail. They were separated, placed in individual holding cells, and told they'd be arraigned in the morning. None of them requested lawyers initially. None of them made statements. They just sat in their cells, silent, waiting for whatever came next. At 1:37 a.m. on August 19th, Big Jim asked a guard for a piece of paper and a pencil. He wrote a letter to Ruth Ann that said, "I did what had to be done. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't want it. But I need you to know I'd do it again. Some things matter more than freedom. I love you. Tell our sons I'm proud of them." The guard, who'd known Big Jim for 20 years, read the letter and cried. The arraignment took place at 10 a.m. on August 19, 1983, in Mingo County Circuit Court before Judge Harold Simmons, a 72-year-old native of Williamson who'd been on the bench for 34 years. The courtroom, designed to hold 87 people, had 219 packed inside and another 150 outside on the courthouse lawn. James Edward Sullivan, Michael David Sullivan, Daniel James Sullivan, and Robert Edward Sullivan were each charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. If convicted on all counts, each faced 13 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The prosecution was handled by Mingo County Prosecutor Elizabeth Hartford, 41, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas McBride, 37, specially assigned from Charleston because this case had become nationally significant. The defense was a patchwork of court-appointed attorneys and one private lawyer paid for by a fundraising effort at Big Jim's church. The community was split. Half viewed the Sullivans as murderers who'd committed an unforgivable atrocity. Half viewed them as desperate men driven to extremes by a system that protected lawyers and corporations while abandoning working families. The Hartley families wanted execution. West Virginia had abolished the death penalty in 1965, but several widows publicly stated they wished they could pull the switch themselves. Meanwhile, 317 people signed a petition asking the governor for leniency, arguing the Sullivans had been provoked beyond endurance. The trial began on February 6, 1984, 6 months after the murders. Jury selection took 11 days because finding 12 people without strong opinions was nearly impossible in a county of 37,000, where everyone knew everyone. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ages 32 to 68, including 3 former minors, 2 teachers, a nurse, a grocery store clerk, a bank teller, a retired postal worker, a mechanic, a seamstress, and a construction worker. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented physical evidence, tire tracks, boot prints, DNA from cigarette butts, diesel fuel receipts, witness testimony from Marcus Johnson, who'd seen 4 figures watching, timeline evidence showing all 4 defendants had no alibis for the time of the murders. They presented motive evidence, the mineral rights dispute, Big Jim's public threats, his failed attempts at legal resolution, expert testimony from mining engineers explaining exactly how the fire had been designed to trap and kill, testimony from the medical examiner describing in clinical detail how each victim had died, how long they'd suffered, what their final moments would have felt like. By the time the prosecution rested after 6 weeks of testimony, there was no question the Sullivan men were guilty. The only question was whether the jury would care about why they'd done it. The defense strategy was nullification. They weren't arguing innocence, they were arguing justification. Their lead attorney, Marcus Webb, 63, a criminal defense lawyer from Charleston who'd taken the case pro bono, spent 4 weeks presenting context. Economic expert testimony about coal industry collapse, statistics showing unemployment, poverty, suicide rates in Appalachia, legal expert testimony about how mineral rights disputes were systematically unresolvable for poor families, testimony from miners explaining mountain codes, the idea that when law fails, men make their own justice, character witnesses describing Big Jim as a decorated veteran, a faithful husband, a man who'd worked 34 years in the mines and asked for nothing except what was legally his. Webb called Richard Vance, the Mountaineer Development Corporation lawyer, and destroyed him on cross-examination. Got him to admit the company was a shell corporation. got him to admit the 1932 lease had questionable validity, got him to admit he'd encouraged Frank Hartley to mine despite knowing the Sullivan family's claim, established that Vance had profited $60,000 from stolen coal, while the Hartley crew and Sullivan family destroyed each other. The prosecution objected repeatedly. Judge Simmons sustained most objections. But the jury heard it. They heard that lawyers and corporations had created this disaster. They heard that the system had failed everyone involved. And when Big Jim Sullivan finally took the stand on April 3, 1984, they heard something that would divide the courtroom. Big Jim testified for 7 hours. He admitted everything: planning the fire, recruiting his sons, blocking exits, staying to watch. He showed no remorse. Told the jury he'd warned Frank Hartley. Told the jury the law had refused to help. Told the jury his great-grandfather had bought those mineral rights in 1897 and 4 generations had protected them, and he'd be damned if he'd be the one to lose them without a fight. The prosecution asked if he understood he'd killed 13 innocent people. Big Jim said they weren't innocent. They were thieves. If the same situation happened tomorrow, he'd make the same choice because some things mattered more than life or freedom. Legacy mattered. Honor mattered. Protecting what your family built mattered. And if the jury wanted to punish him for that, he'd accept their punishment, but he wouldn't apologize for defending what was his. The jury deliberated for 63 hours across 9 days. They sent out 12 questions to Judge Simmons about the definition of premeditation, about whether economic duress could be a mitigating factor, about whether they could convict on lesser charges. Simmons answered that West Virginia law was clear. Intentional killing was murder. Motive didn't change that. On April 18, 1984, the jury returned with verdicts. Guilty on all counts, for all 4 defendants. But they also submitted a written recommendation for minimum sentences, citing extraordinary circumstances. On May 2, 1984, Judge Simmons sentenced James Edward Sullivan to life in prison without parole. Michael, Daniel, and Robert Sullivan each received 45 years to 90 years, eligible for parole after 35 years served. The courtroom erupted. Hartley family members screaming it wasn't enough. Sullivan supporters screaming it was too much. Deputies had to clear the room, and Big Jim Sullivan, being led away in chains, looked back at Ruth Ann one last time and smiled. Ruth Ann Sullivan watched her husband and 3 sons disappear into the West Virginia correctional system, and something inside her broke that would never heal. She was 51 years old, alone in a house built for 5 people, with a mortgage she couldn't pay and a name that had become synonymous with mass murder. The community that had supported Big Jim before the trial turned cold after the verdicts. Her church asked her to stop attending because her presence upset the Hartley families who also worshipped there. The grocery store where she'd worked cleaning houses told her they'd received complaints and couldn't employ her anymore. By June 1984, Ruth Ann was surviving on Social Security survivor benefits from Big Jim's father and food from a neighbor who left groceries on her porch at night to avoid being seen helping her. Sarah Sullivan, Robert's wife, faced even worse ostracism. She was 26 years old, with a 9-month-old daughter, and a husband in prison for the next 35 years minimum. Her family disowned her, told her she should have left Robert when she discovered what he'd planned, blamed her for not going to police. She moved to Ohio in September 1984, changed her last name back to her maiden name, told her daughter that her father had died in a mining accident. The daughter, Emma, wouldn't learn the truth until she was 17 and found newspaper clippings her mother had hidden in a storage box. Emma had a breakdown, dropped out of high school, spent 3 years in therapy trying to reconcile the grandfather she'd never met with the man who'd burned 13 people alive. Big Jim Sullivan never expressed remorse, not at trial, not in prison, not in the 41 years he would spend incarcerated before dying of a heart attack in 2024, at age 92. He wrote letters to Ruth Ann every week for 30 years, until her death in 2014. The letters, which Ruth Ann saved, and which were later donated to the West Virginia State Archives, are remarkable for their consistency. Big Jim wrote about daily life in prison, about books he was reading, about his health, but he never once apologized for what he'd done. In a letter dated March 15, 2003, he wrote, "I know the world thinks I'm a monster. Maybe I am, but I protected what was ours." Michael Sullivan was stabbed in prison in 1991 during a dispute over a television channel. The wound punctured his lung. He survived, but developed chronic respiratory problems. In 2009, he was granted compassionate release due to terminal emphysema and stage 4 lung cancer. He died 6 weeks later in Ruth Ann's house at age 56. Ruth Ann buried him in the family plot next to his grandfather. 7 people attended the funeral. Daniel became the most remorseful of the 4 Sullivan men. He wrote letters to every Hartley family, letters that were returned unopened or burned unread. He participated in every educational program the prison offered, earned his GED, took college correspondence courses, studied philosophy and ethics trying to understand what he'd become. Robert Sullivan suffered the deepest psychological damage. He attempted suicide in 1988 by hanging. Guards cut him down after 4 minutes. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation left him with memory problems and a speech impediment. He attempted suicide again in 1995 by slitting his wrists. In 2001, a prison psychologist diagnosed him with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, and profound existential guilt. Robert was released on parole in 2018 after serving 35 years. He moved to a group home in Huntington and died of a drug overdose in 2020. Keisha Maxwell gave birth to her daughter, Amara, on October 3, 1983, 46 days after Jerome's death. She named the baby after Jerome's grandmother, honored his request even though he wasn't there to see it. Keisha was 26 years old, a widow with a newborn and no income. She moved back in with her mother in Charleston, worked as a cashier at a pharmacy, raised Amara alone. Amara grew up knowing her father only through photographs and stories. She excelled in school, earned a scholarship to West Virginia University, became a nurse like her mother had wanted, but she also developed severe anxiety and depression in her 20s, struggled with relationships, told her therapist she felt like she was born from tragedy and could never escape it. Susan Hartley, Frank's widow, became the public face of the victims' families. She testified at trial, spoke to media, attended every parole hearing for the Sullivan men. She was 43 when Frank died, mother to 2 adult children who'd left home, suddenly alone in a house full of memories. She never remarried, told friends that Frank had been the love of her life, and that love didn't reset just because he was gone. She worked as a school secretary in Williamson for 27 years, retired in 2010, and died in 2017 at age 77. Her obituary requested donations to a scholarship fund she'd established in Frank's name that had helped 34 Mingo County students attend college. Rebecca Hartley, Tommy's widow, never forgave anyone. Her daughters were 14 and 16 when their father died, old enough to understand, young enough to be permanently scarred. The older daughter, Christine, developed an eating disorder and substance abuse problems, was in and out of rehabilitation facilities through her 20s, died of an overdose in 1998 at age 29. The younger daughter, Amanda, married at 18 to escape home, divorced at 21, married again at 24, divorced again at 28, spent her 30s in therapy trying to understand why she couldn't maintain relationships. Rebecca herself became an alcoholic, lost her job at a clothing store in 1987, lost her house in 1990, lived in subsidized housing until her death from liver failure in 2006 at age 63. Mei Chen, David's widow, spoke almost no English and struggled to navigate American systems without her husband. The Chinese community in Williamson, approximately 40 families, rallied around her. They helped with paperwork, with child care, with finding work, May took a job at a restaurant, worked 14-hour days, raised her 3 children alone. Her oldest son, David Jr., became an engineer, exactly what his father had wanted. Her daughter, Lily, became a teacher. Her youngest son, Marcus, named after the co-worker who'd tried to save his father, became a firefighter. May never returned to China. She told her children that America had taken their father, but America was still their home. The 7 surface crew victims left families equally devastated. Maria Garcia's 2 children, ages 7 and 4 when she died, were raised by her mother in a trailer that seemed to shrink as they grew. Her son, Eduardo, joined the Marines at 18, served 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, came home with PTSD and traumatic brain injury, killed himself in 2011 at age 35. Thomas Wright's cousin became an advocate for mine safety reform, testified before Congress in 1985, pushed for regulations requiring redundant escape systems. Marcus Johnson's 3 teenage sons all ended up in prison at various points. The oldest told a judge during sentencing, "My father died trying to save people, and what did it get him?" The Red Bird mine property was sealed by federal order in September 1983, deemed too dangerous for any future operations due to structural damage from the fire. The main shaft was filled with concrete. The emergency exit was welded shut. The surface buildings were demolished in 1986 after vandals repeatedly broke in and local teenagers reported it was haunted. By 1990, the site was nothing but a cleared area with warning signs posted every 50 feet. The coal seam beneath, the Sullivan seam, that had been worth $2.3 million and 13 lives, remains untouched. Courts ruled in 1986 that the Sullivan family had superior claim, but there was no Sullivan family left to exercise it. Today, the Red Bird mine site is part of a reclamation project attempting to restore mountain ridges stripped by decades of coal mining. Trees have been planted, mostly pine and poplar, fast-growing species that can tolerate acidic soil. The access road is overgrown, barely passable even with 4-wheel drive. Local hikers occasionally find the site, usually by accident. Some leave flowers. Most just feel an inexplicable sadness they can't quite name. In 2015, a paranormal investigation team from Charleston got permission to visit the site overnight. They reported temperature fluctuations, unexplained sounds, feelings of being watched. The team leader told a podcast interviewer, "I've never felt evil before. Not real evil, but that mine. There's something wrong there." Mingo County itself changed dramatically in the 4 decades following the fire. Population dropped from 37,000 in 1983 to 23,000 in 2025, a 38% decline. The coal industry that had sustained the region for 100 years was effectively dead. The last major mine closed in 2012. Unemployment in 2025 hovers around 34%, even higher than it was in 1983. Williamson looks like a town in managed decline. Half the storefronts on Main Street are empty. The movie theater closed in 1998. Young people leave for college and never return. But for a few years after the fire, something changed in Mingo County. People were kinder to each other. Disputes over property lines were settled quietly. Churches filled on Sundays as people sought meaning in tragedy. Community organizations raised money for victims' families, for mine safety equipment, for memorial scholarships. There was a sense that maybe the horror of 13 deaths could teach lessons about choosing law over violence. But the change didn't last. Within a decade, new people moved in who didn't know the story. The economic pressures that had driven Big Jim Sullivan to mass murder never really left. Sheriff Dale Perkins, who'd been a deputy in 1983, served as sheriff from 1992 until 2008. In a 2022 interview, he said, "I'm 65 now. I've spent my entire career in law enforcement thinking about that case. Legally, it was clear-cut murder. But morally, it still haunts me. Because Big Jim Sullivan wasn't wrong about the system failing him. He was wrong about his response. But he wasn't wrong about the failure. FBI Special Agent Raymond Cross, who'd led the federal investigation, retired in 2012. In a 2023 podcast, he said, "I've investigated serial killers who murdered for pleasure. The Sullivan men murdered for legacy, for family, for what they believed was justice. 42 years have passed since that August night in the West Virginia mountains. The Sullivan men are gone now. Big Jim died in prison in 2024. Michael died of cancer in 2009. Robert died of an overdose in 2020. Daniel died of lung cancer in 2023, after serving 39 years. Ruth Ann Sullivan died alone in 2014, buried next to the husband she'd visited in prison every month for 30 years. The Hartley crew is gone. 13 people who died for the crime of trying to survive in an economy that had abandoned them. Most of their families are gone too. Widows and parents who carried grief to their graves. The Redbird mine site remains abandoned, a clearing in the woods where nothing grows quite right. On August 18th of each year, a few people still visit, mostly descendants of victims, though occasionally someone connected to the Sullivan family. They don't talk to each other. They leave flowers at different spots, maintain separate vigils, carry separate griefs that will never reconcile. There's no official memorial at the site. The state refused to erect one, concerned it would become a shrine to either victims or perpetrators depending on perspective. So there's just an unmarked clearing and people who remember. James Edward Sullivan's story has no heroes. It has a father who loved his family more than 13 human lives and believed legacy mattered more than law. It has 13 victims who were trying to survive impossible economic conditions and made the fatal mistake of trusting lawyers who didn't care if they lived or died. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that crushed Appalachia and left people fighting over scraps, a legal framework that protected corporations while abandoning individuals, courts so backlogged that property disputes took years to resolve while families starved, and a culture of mountain justice so ingrained that violence seemed like the only response. Was Big Jim Sullivan a murderer? Yes. He planned and executed the deaths of 13 people with premeditation and precision. He showed no remorse. He stated he'd do it again given the same circumstances. He destroyed 24 families, orphaned children, created generational trauma. Was he also a desperate father in a failed system, driven to extremes by circumstances beyond his control, following codes his grandfather had taught him? Also yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing part because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. Big Jim Sullivan crossed a boundary no human being should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where a man's legacy could be stolen legally, where courts took years to resolve what needed resolution immediately, where lawyers profited from exploiting poor families. There's no easy answer, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create their own monsters. And sometimes the line between justice and revenge becomes so thin, it disappears entirely. If this story made you think about justice, legacy, and the price we pay when systems fail, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong. Comment below, what would you have done in Big Jim Sullivan's position? Where do you draw the line between protecting your family's legacy and losing your humanity? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now, somewhere in forgotten corners where the system has failed. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made, one stolen seam, one failed system, one desperate August night at a time.